The Missouri River in the autumn of 1873 wasn't a forgiving body of water. It ran brown and cold between its cutbanks, carrying the season's debris downstream without ceremony, and it had little patience for the things men left behind on its shores. There were, in those years, a number of wrecked and abandoned craft rotting along its lower reaches, the casualties of snags and floods and financial ruin, and the river worked at them steadily and without sentiment, pulling the planking apart, plank by plank, season by season, until there was nothing left but a stain in the mud and the memory of a name. One of those wrecks was the Emmeline Bray, a sidewheel steamboat that had gone aground during the flood of the previous spring and come to rest at a hard angle against the eastern bank, near the town of Castor's Landing, Missouri. By the time the water fell, the boat's keel had broken in two places. The paddle housing on the port side had collapsed entirely, and the forward salon windows had been staved in by a floating timber. The owners, a St. Louis freight company called Alderman Hatch and Sons, had looked at the wreck and the cost of salvage and made a swift calculation. They had stripped what could be stripped: the brass hardware, the serviceable rope, the copper fittings from the engine room, the navigation instruments, the captain's logbooks, the bell, which was a good bronze bell worth selling. They left the rest. The Emmeline Bray sat in the mud, listing 5 degrees to starboard, and the river continued its work on the remaining timbers. The auction was held on a Thursday morning in early October, with a cold wind off the water and no more than a dozen men in attendance. The auctioneer, a Mr. Garfield Potts, read out the lot with the particular weariness of a man who does not expect much from a given morning. What was offered was the hulk itself, the wreck, the remaining hull timbers and interior fittings, whatever remained below the stripped decks, and the right of title to remove or dispose of it as the buyer saw fit. There were no competing offers. One man asked if the boiler was included and was told it had been removed in August. He shook his head and walked back toward the road. A second man looked at the list of identified interior contents and asked about a specific iron safe noted on the inventory, and was told the combination was unknown and the safe was too heavy to move without equipment. He did not bid. The young woman who raised her hand and offered $1 was 26 years old, and she had arrived that morning by the Hannibal Road, walking the last 4 miles from the junction where the farm wagon that had given her a ride had turned off toward a different destination. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder that held a change of clothing, an account book, a short pencil, a folded wool blanket, and a small amount of cornbread wrapped in cloth. She had exactly $1.14 to her name. Her name was Vera Gill. She was the granddaughter of a river pilot on her mother's side and the daughter of a ship's carpenter on her father's, and she had grown up watching Emmett Gill work on the wooden rivercraft that came through the Hannibal yards for repair. She had handed him tools before she was tall enough to see over the gunwale. He had taught her the names of the timbers, the ribs and the strakes, the deadwood and the keel, the way each type of wood moved differently when it was wet and when it dried, and the difference between the sounds a sound timber made and the sound a failing one made when you struck it. He had taught her to read a hull the way a doctor reads a patient, by examination rather than assumption, and he had told her that the first question was always what the structure had survived, not what it had lost. Emmett Gill had died of a fever when Vera was 17, leaving her his tools and his method, and she had spent the 9 years since working where she could find it, most recently for a freight company out of St. Joseph, keeping their cargo weight records and doing structural assessments of freight wagons, until the company's owner, a man named Ord, had dismissed her 3 months prior upon learning she had filed a formal complaint with the county land office regarding billing discrepancies in his freight contracts. He had paid her what he owed and not 1 cent more, and he had made clear she would not work in that county again through his connections. She had taken the $1 that remained after settling her room bill, and she had walked east along the river road, reading the water and thinking. Garfield Potts looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the assembled men who said nothing. He looked at his ledger and then back at her. He said, $1 then. She said $1. He wrote it down. She paid him the coin from her coat pocket and received a receipt on a half sheet of paper with the auction date and the lot description, and her name spelled correctly because she had spelled it for him. The laughter, when it came, wasn't mean-spirited exactly, or not entirely. The men who laughed were men who had seen the wreck and who understood what $1 had purchased, and who found the arithmetic of the situation amusing in the way that a person finds amusing any arrangement whose outcome seems already known. The Emmeline Bray had weighed 420 tons when she was launched from the Cincinnati yards in 1861. What she now owned was the degraded remainder of that weight, embedded in riverbank mud at a hard angle. And she appeared to the men watching her to own very little else. She stood at the water's edge that afternoon and looked at the boat for a long time. The wind moved the dry grass on the bank around her feet. The light came off the river at a low angle, and the wreck threw a long shadow onto the water to the east of it. It is worth pausing here to say something about what she saw when she looked at the Emmeline Bray that her father had taught her to see. Her father, Emmett Gill, had spent 30 years building and repairing wooden rivercraft, and he had passed to his daughter not merely the technical knowledge of a shipwright, but the habit of reading a structure's condition beneath its appearance. She had grown up knowing the difference between cosmetic damage and structural damage, between planking that had been pulled away by salvagers and planking that had rotted from within, between a frame that had failed under stress and a frame that had flexed and held. She understood that a hull that grounded on mud took a different kind of damage than a hull that struck rock. She could see from the shape of the wreck and the angle of the list and the condition of the exposed strakes that the Emmeline Bray had come to rest gradually in the flood rather than driven hard aground by current. The keel had broken, yes, but the lower hull planking on the starboard side remained largely intact. The timbers were wet-rotted in places, but not through. The boat was not salvageable as a working vessel. That was not why she had bid on it. What she had bid on was the question of what the salvagers had left when they had taken what was easy to carry. She spent that first night sheltered on the main deck, which sat well above the river's current level in the boat's listing position and had not been flooded in the spring event. She had no lantern. She ate the cornbread she had carried in her bag, leaning against the pilot house wall out of the wind, and listened to the river working at the timbers below her. The Missouri in October made a particular sound at the bank, a low, steady pull and a small rhythmic slap where the current found a gap in the hull planking, and she sat with it until it was full dark, and then wrapped herself in the wool blanket and slept. In the morning, with the light gray and the air cold enough to show her breath, she began her inventory. She started at the bow and worked aft and down. The forward deck was open and stripped. The rope cleats were gone. The forward winch hardware was gone. The anchor chain had been pulled. The main salon, one deck below the main deck level, had taken the flood badly. A foot of dried gray silt covered the floor, cracked into plates in the places where it had dried and still soft in the center where a shadow had kept it damp. The ceiling was stained a high water mark at roughly 4 feet, a distinct line of mineral deposit and dark wood, above which the salon's original varnished paneling was intact, and the brass lamp brackets were still in place, though the lamps themselves had been taken. The smell inside was of old river mud and mildew, and something she identified as the particular dry odor of wood that has been wet many times and dried again, the smell of a boat that has lived a long life on the water. She catalogued what she found in the account book with the short pencil, moving slowly. The swollen doors of the forward staterooms required a shoulder to open one at a time, the wood having expanded in the flood and not returned to its original dimension. Inside the first stateroom, the narrow rope bed was still bolted to the wall, its mattress gone but its frame intact. A small writing table had tipped off its bracket and lay on its side in the silt. The drawer still closed. She opened the drawer and found 2 corroded brass coat hooks and a folded piece of paper, blank, that fell apart when she touched it. The second stateroom was nearly identical. The third held nothing but silt and a pewter candlestick standing on a shelf that had held, its candle long since removed by someone or dissolved by the water. She could not say which. She noted the materials, the condition, the fastening type, the state of the hardware remaining. She was not yet thinking about what to do with any of it. She was still reading the structure, still asking her first question, which was always what it had survived. The captain's quarters were at the stern of the main deck, above the floodline, accessed through a narrow companionway that the salvagers had walked through going to and from the engine room. The door was unlocked, the latch plate still in place. The salvagers had been through the room and had taken the navigational instruments from the chart table, the logbooks from the shelf above it, and whatever personal effects the captain had kept in the small closet along the port wall, which stood empty and open. What remained was the room itself, the chart table, the chair behind it, the fixed bunk along the starboard wall, and bolted to the aft wall beneath the porthole, an iron safe. It was a box-form safe, roughly 2 feet square and 30 inches in height, of the type that had been manufactured in Cincinnati through the 1860s by 3 or 4 companies that competed for the river trade. She could tell the general type by the proportions and the construction of the operating handle, a 4-spoke iron wheel of the kind that required 2 hands to turn. The door was set flush with the face of the safe and mounted at its center with a combination lock, a disc-style mechanism with numbered positions around its circumference and a fixed indicator above. The safe was lag-bolted through the aft wall of the captain's cabin into the hull's transom framing, 4 heavy bolts she could see from where she stood, which explained why the salvagers had not taken it. It would have required a full day's work to remove it without damaging either the safe or the hull, and Alderman Hatch and Sons had not thought the contents, if any, justified that work. They had tagged it on their inventory as contents unknown and left it where it sat. Vera Gill stood in the captain's quarters and looked at it for a long time, the same way she had stood at the water's edge the previous afternoon and looked at the Emmeline Bray. The porthole above the safe let in a circle of gray October light that fell across the top of the iron box, and the combination lock's disc threw a small shadow in that light, a thin crescent. She did not touch the lock that day. She sat down at the chart table and looked at the safe from across the room for a while, and then she went back to her inventory. She knew combination locks. Her father had owned one, a small luggage model that a customer had paid him with instead of cash, some failed debt arrangement of theirs that Vera had never fully understood. Emmett Gill had found the lock amusing rather than useful, and had set it on a shelf in the workroom where she could practice with it, teaching her to read the mechanism by feel rather than by sight. The principle, he had explained, was that a combination lock's tumblers had to settle into specific, notched positions in sequence, and that each notch, when it caught, created a faint increase in resistance in the dial that a careful hand could feel. He called it reading the lock's handwriting. He had taught her to do it with her eyes closed, turning the dial with 2 fingers and waiting for the slight catch of each tumbler, until she could open his small luggage lock without looking at the numbers at all. She had been 14 years old when she first opened it that way. She had been 12 when she first tried. That had been a 3-tumbler mechanism on a light commercial lock. This was a 4-tumbler Cincinnati mechanism on a heavy case built for the river trade, and it had been sealed, she judged, from the undisturbed condition of the lock face and the lack of scratching around the dial since before the flood. Perhaps for a long time before the flood. She began on the second day. She cleared the silt from the captain's cabin floor with a plank she found on the main deck, pushing it out through the porthole, working for 2 hours until the boards beneath were clean enough to sit on without fouling her clothing. Then she settled cross-legged on the floor beside the safe, her back against the stern wall, her left hand on the combination dial, and her right hand resting on her knee where she could feel its own small signals, the slight tremor that told her when she was pressing too hard, the steadiness that told her when she had found the right touch. She began turning the dial slowly, starting at 0 and moving counterclockwise through the full range, one position at a time. Her father had told her to begin with the year a thing was made, on any lock that used numbers, because craftsmen who set default combinations used what was near at hand, and the manufacturing date was always near at hand. She began there. The safe was Cincinnati manufacture. She had seen the style before in the yards at Hannibal. She guessed 1863, based on the design of the handle, and she tried that sequence first and felt nothing. Then she went back to the beginning and read the dial through, position by position. The first tumbler gave itself up to her on the first afternoon. It was not a number she had expected, high in the range, and she wrote it in her account book and continued through the second and third and fourth positions without finding the next catch. She went as long as the light permitted and then stopped. On the morning of the second day, she found the second tumbler by midday, and the third by late afternoon. She ate a small amount of cornbread and drank water from the river, boiled first in a tin she had found in the salon, and she slept well that night because she was tired, and because she was close, and because she had learned from her father that you did not keep working past tiredness. You stopped and slept and came back sharp. And the thing always made more sense in the morning. The fourth tumbler was the most difficult. She sat with it through the morning and into the afternoon, her fingers going stiff in the cold that settled into the captain's quarters as the day went on, the porthole light shifting from gray to a weak yellow as the sun moved behind the wreck. She warmed her hands inside her coat at intervals and returned to the dial. She found it in the late afternoon, a faint catch that she might have missed if she had been hurrying, a brief resistance and then a release, and she wrote the number down and sat still for a moment. Then she took the 4 numbers in sequence and set the dial through them, one at a time, and turned the operating handle, and the door opened. She did not look inside immediately. She sat with her hand on the open door and was quiet. The river made its sound against the hull. The porthole light was almost gone. There was, inside the Emmeline Bray's captain's safe, a canvas pouch. She lifted it out and set it on the floor beside her and untied the cord at its neck. Inside the pouch was currency, folded paper currency in denominations of $10 and $20, and she counted it in the last of the light by moving each bill to a separate stack. $430. She sat with the money in her hands and breathed carefully and did not rush. Beneath the canvas pouch, at the back of the safe, was a ledger. She took it out and held it. It was a small leather-covered book, the kind used by commercial offices, with a brass clasp at one end and the word "Accounts" stamped on the front cover in gold foil that had largely flaked away, leaving only the ghost of the letters in the impression the foil had made in the leather. She did not open it right away. She set it on the floor beside the money and closed the safe door and sat in the dark for a little while. She opened the ledger by feel in the dark, turning the first page, and then decided she needed light and set it aside until morning. In the morning, she read it at the captain's chart table, in the gray light from the porthole with the account book open beside her and the pencil ready. It was the record of a man named Captain Willard Soper, who had commanded the Emmeline Bray from 1865 until the spring of 1873. The first page carried his name and the boat's name and the year he had started the ledger. After that, the pages held entries, each with a date, an amount paid out, and a column of references. The amounts were not consistent, ranging from $20 to $200, and they were not frequent, appearing perhaps 3 or 4 times a year over the full period the ledger covered. Each entry had a corresponding notation in the right-hand margin, a number, and those numbers followed a format she recognized as the numbering format used by county land registries along the Missouri. She had seen that format on the survey records she had filed at the land office in St. Joseph. Each number was a parcel identifier. She turned the pages slowly, reading every entry. The column of payments was marked at its head with the initials AHS, Alderman Hatch and Sons. The payments were what Captain Soper had received from the company that owned his boat for something he had done in connection with specific parcels of land along the river. The ledger did not say what he had done. It said only the date, the amount, and the parcel number. And it said it in the careful handwriting of a man who kept accounts because he thought accounts mattered. A man who wrote down what had happened because he believed a record was a record, and a record could not be argued with. She closed the ledger and held it in both hands and looked at the porthole. She spent that day and part of the following morning at the courthouse annex in Castor's Landing, in the land records room. The room smelled of dust and old paper, and the shelves were deep with bound volumes organized by township and year. The clerk, Mr. Hale, was a young man with an ink stain on his left middle finger, and the manner of someone who had spent most of his working life in this room and found it satisfactory. He understood what she was looking for well enough to retrieve the right volumes without her having to explain twice. She asked to see the transfer records for the parcels identified in the ledger, going by the lot numbers she had copied into her account book. She asked to see the survey documentation attached to each transfer. She asked to see any objections filed in connection with those transfers, which were sometimes kept in the back of the folder if no one had thought to discard them. Mr. Hale retrieved what there was. He set it on the table without comment and returned to his desk. What she found, laid out on the records table in a systematic order she made herself, was a pattern. 8 parcels of land, formerly held by individual settlers and one small farming family named Castor, had transferred to Alderman Hatch and Sons over a period of 6 years, between 1866 and 1872. Always at prices that registered in the county records as agreed sale prices. 3 of those transfers had margin notations in the record, each reading dispute at time of transfer, settled per survey record. The surveys attached to those 3 transfers, and to 2 others she checked out of thoroughness, had all been conducted by the same surveyor, a man whose certification number appeared on each document. The surveys had understated the productive river bottom land on each parcel by between 15 and 30%, placing that acreage into a boundary classification that made it transferable at a lower assessed rate. The difference, across 8 parcels over 6 years, was not a small sum. She looked at the surveyor's name. She looked at the certification number. She looked at the dates. Then she opened the ledger and found the parcel numbers from the survey documents and matched them to Soper's entries. The dates of Soper's payments followed the survey dates by a matter of weeks. The amounts corresponded roughly to a fraction of the value difference on each parcel. He had transported the surveyor on the Emmeline Bray's regular runs along that reach of the river. He had delivered the falsified documents. He had received his payments. He had written all of it down. She did not know, sitting at that records table, whether Captain Willard Soper had understood what he was participating in from the beginning, or whether he had learned it gradually. The ledger was not a confession. It did not explain itself. It was a record, as neat and impersonal as any ledger, and it left the question of his conscience to someone else to answer. She thought about the word the obituary had used for him, honest. She thought about a man who keeps a record of his transactions, even the ones he cannot speak of openly, and she thought that the habit of accounting was not so different from the habit of honesty, even when the two pointed in different directions. There was a Castor family objection in the folder for the largest of the transfers. It was a handwritten document, 3 pages, filed in 1869 by the head of the household, a man named Thomas Castor. The objection laid out, in plain and somewhat formal language, the Castor family's belief that the acreage represented in the sale documents did not match the acreage they understood themselves to be selling, based on their own knowledge of where their land ran down to the river and where the next property began. The objection had been dismissed on the grounds that the survey record was certified and controlling. Thomas Castor had signed the dismissal acknowledgement in a hand that got thinner toward the signature, the pen pressing lighter as he went, the way a man's hand sometimes does when he is writing something he cannot argue with and has run out of strength for the argument. She sat with that document for a while. Then she set it down and asked Mr. Hale if there was a notary in the building. He looked up from his work. He said there was not a notary, but that the county land assessor, a man named Barton Gage, was in the building that afternoon, if that was of any relevance. She said it might be. She went down the hall and knocked on a door with a hand-painted sign. Barton Gage read the written summary she had prepared that morning at the chart table on the Emmeline Bray, working from her notes and the ledger entries and the survey documents she had reviewed, writing it out in plain language with specific dates and lot numbers and the surveyor's certification number listed in order. He read it slowly, turning each page back when he had finished it and reading certain passages again. He was a heavy-set man in a good wool coat that was not quite warm enough for the room, and he read the way some people do with a visible stillness, his hands flat on the desk and only his eyes moving. When he had finished the summary, he asked to see the ledger. She set it on the desk and he turned the pages the same way, with careful hands, stopping at intervals. He said, finally, that if the land records showed what she described and the ledger was what it appeared to be, there was a basis for a formal review of the surveying certifications in question. He said a review would take time. He said the parties affected would need to be identified and notified. He said he would want to speak to the county attorney. She said she understood all of that. She asked him one specific question. In a review of this kind, if the survey had been conducted by a party with an undisclosed financial interest in the outcome, would the families who had been misrepresented in the transfers have standing to make a claim for the difference in value between what was recorded and what was accurate? He looked at her for a moment. He said, carefully, that it would depend on a number of factors, but that in principle, yes, where a material misrepresentation in a survey could be demonstrated, and where the relationship between the surveyor and the benefiting party could be documented, a claim was possible. She thanked him and returned to the records room, where she spent another 2 hours making careful copies of the relevant survey pages and the Castor objection, writing them out by hand in her account book. She had the originals themselves, which she would need to leave in the assessor's hands. She wanted copies she could carry. She asked Mr. Hale if he would witness her copies as accurate transcriptions of the originals. He looked at her for a moment and then said he would, and he did. Back at the water's edge, Rue Katz had his line out in the same spot he had been fishing for 3 days. He was an old man with a narrow face and a brown coat that had been mended at both elbows, and he acknowledged her approach with a nod and kept his eyes on the line. She sat down on the bank beside him without asking and looked at the river. She asked him if he had fished this stretch for long. He said 20 years, near enough. She asked him what he knew about the Castor family and the land along the lower reach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he wound his line in and rested the pole across his knees and looked at the river himself, not at her. And he told her. He had known the Castors. Thomas Castor had been a neighbor of a neighbor, not a close acquaintance, but a man he recognized, a man who had farmed good river-bottom land and known what he had. When the Hatch Company had come with the survey and the offer, Thomas Castor had argued, and the argument had gone nowhere because the survey was certified, and the company had lawyers in St. Louis, and Thomas Castor did not. He had sold. He had moved his family east. 3 or 4 other families along that reach had gone the same way, some with less resistance, some with more. And the land along the lower reach was now all Hatch Company land, used for freight staging rather than farming, which was perhaps not the best use of good river bottom, but which was not anyone's business to say. He had not liked it at the time. He had thought the prices did not match what the land was worth. You could not argue a certified survey in a county court without money and a lawyer, and most of those families had neither. She told him what she had found in the safe. He was quiet for a long time. The line lay across his knees and the river moved past them, brown and steady and cold. He said, "There is a daughter, a Castor daughter, who married a man named Abelson and lives out in Waverly, about 40 miles east. He said her name was Ruth." She asked if he thought Ruth Abelson would want to know. He looked at her directly for the first time. He said, "Yes." He said, "I think she would want to know very much." She walked to Waverly the following day, or most of it. The road was dry enough for good walking in the morning and the middle of the day, and a farm wagon gave her a ride for the last 8 miles. The driver asking no questions and she volunteering none, both of them riding in a comfortable quiet through the last of the afternoon light with the river visible in the distance below the ridge. She found Ruth Abelson in a house on the west edge of Waverly, a 2-story frame house with a good garden put to bed for winter, the stalks cut and the beds turned. Ruth Abelson came to the door herself. She was a woman of about 40, compact and careful-looking, with dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that were work-hardened in the way that a woman's hands are when she has run a household and a large garden for 20 years without stopping. She looked at her for a moment at the door and then said, "Come in," in the tone of a woman who decides quickly. They sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen was warm. There was a smell of bread from earlier in the day. She laid the ledger on the table, and the copies she had made from the survey documents and the objection her father had filed, and she explained what she had found, and where she had found it, and what it showed, carefully and in order, without editorializing. Ruth Abelson read the summary first, slowly, with the care of someone who wants to understand what they are reading, rather than simply to finish it. She read the copies of the survey documents. She looked at the page of the ledger that showed the Castor parcel number. She said, "My father knew." It was not a question. It was a statement of something she had understood for a long time. She said yes. The ledger confirms what he said he believed. Ruth Abelson sat very still. She put both hands flat on the table, palms down, the way a person steadies themselves when the ground has shifted. She looked at the ledger. She asked what would happen now, what the process was, what could realistically be expected. She told her about Barton Gage and the county assessor's office and the review that had been set in motion. She told her it would take time and that Ruth should find someone with legal knowledge to represent her interests, that there were people who handled this kind of land claim, and that the documentation was solid enough to be worth the effort. She said she would return the original ledger to the assessor's office, but that she had made copies of the relevant pages, signed as accurate, and those copies were Ruth's to keep. She said the ledger was evidence and would be treated as such. Ruth Abelson looked at her. She said, "You bought a wrecked boat?" She said, "Yes." She said, "For $1?" She said, "Yes." Ruth Abelson was quiet for a moment. Then she rose from the table and moved to the stove and put the kettle on, with the deliberate movements of a woman who needs something to do with her hands while she settles something inside herself. She did not say anything more about the ledger or the land for a while. She asked about the Emmeline Bray, how badly it had grounded, whether anything of the woodwork was worth keeping. She asked about the river at Castor's Landing, whether it had flooded badly in the spring. She asked about her father, having gathered from something Vera had said that her knowledge of boats had come from him. And Vera told her about Emmett Gill, about the yards at Hannibal, about the tools he had left her and the way he had taught her to read a structure by what it had survived, rather than by what it had lost. They sat together in the kitchen while the day went down. The kettle came to a boil, and Ruth Abelson made tea and they drank it. And the house was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a house where children are asleep somewhere, on the upper floor. And the adults have been talking long enough that the conversation has moved past the urgent thing that started it into something steadier and more ordinary. The review conducted by Barton Gage's office took 11 months. The surveyor's certification records were pulled and compared against the lot surveys in question, and an independent resurveying was ordered for 3 of the 8 parcels to establish accurate acreage. The results confirmed what the ledger and the Castor objection had suggested. The productive river bottom acreage on each surveyed parcel had been understated, in some cases significantly, in the original documents used for the transfers. The surveyor involved, a man named Clement Basque, who had been active in 3 counties along that reach of the river over the preceding decade, surrendered his certification before a hearing could be completed. The hearing proceeded without him, and his certification was revoked in his absence. Alderman Hatch and Sons, by the time the review completed its findings, had restructured following a series of debt obligations that had come due more or less simultaneously. 2 of the principal partners had moved their interests to Kansas City. The legal proceedings that followed from the review were slow and required the county attorney, a circuit judge, and eventually a federal land officer who had to travel down from Jefferson City with the relevant federal records regarding land classification along the river. They resolved over a period of years in the careful and unglamorous way that land claims resolve, through correspondence and hearings and the slow accumulation of documented fact. The Castors had sold and departed, and 3 other families had done the same. But 3 families had stayed within a day's travel and were still present to receive what the review determined they were owed. Ruth Abelson was present for the final determination. She did not testify dramatically. She brought the copies she had been given in good order and confirmed the dates and the family history when she was asked. And she shook the land assessor's hand afterward in the hallway of the county courthouse and said nothing that could be recalled later. She was not a woman who required acknowledgement. She had needed the truth established, and it had been established, and the rest was paperwork. The Emmeline Bray was broken up over the following winter by the river, which finished what it had started. The timbers floated downstream one by one and gradually disappeared, the lighter planking first, then the heavier structural members, until by the following spring there was nothing at the bank but the impression of the keel in the mud, a long, smooth depression that filled with water after a rain. The $430 from the canvas pouch she used carefully over the following months. She paid for a room in Castor's Landing through the winter, a small room above a dry goods store, with a window that looked toward the river and good enough light for work. She used a portion of the money to replace the tools that had worn beyond use, and to add 2 tools her father had not owned, but that she had wanted since she began working without him. By the spring, she had a chest of tools and a method and a name that had begun to travel a little along the river, as names do, attached to a particular quality of work. She found employment that season at a yard in Hannibal doing structural surveys on aging craft, the kind of assessment that required someone who could read a hull from inside rather than from the dock, someone who understood what the water had done and what the timbers had survived. The yard owner had not hired a woman for that work before. He said so, not unkindly. She said she understood, and she did the first survey and showed him the written report, and he read it twice and hired her. She was not acknowledged as unusual. She was acknowledged eventually as competent, which was the only currency she had ever wanted. The ledger went into the county assessor's archive in Castor's Landing, where it was cataloged under the review case number and stored with the survey documents and the copies of the Castor objection and the other materials that had been collected over the course of the proceedings. It remained there in the archive, a small leather-covered book with gold foil lettering partly flaked from its cover, sitting in a paper folder inside a bound volume where county records are kept, which is to say indefinitely and without ceremony. Rue Katz fished the eastern bank for 9 more years before he died, and he used the impression left by the Emmeline Bray's keel as a kind of landmark, saying to the people who fished near him that the best catfish were always found just downstream of where a heavy thing had rested, where the silt had settled in a certain way, and the current moved differently for a long distance below. He was right about that, as far as anyone who fished with him could determine. If you have ever walked past a thing that seemed to have nothing left in it, and felt, for just a moment, the pull of not being certain, leave a word below. There are stories along every river that are still waiting for the right hand to open them. There is another one, not far from this one, that begins with a sealed room and a woman who knew what the silence inside it meant. The combination to the safe, if you are wondering, was 4 numbers. Her father had told her to start with the year a thing was made, on any mechanism that used numbers, because the people who set combinations used what was close at hand, and the manufacturing date was always the most available number. She had tried the year first and been wrong, and then she had read the dial as her father had taught her to read it, patiently and from the beginning, and she had found what was there. That was what he had always told her. You do not guess at the numbers. You read the lock's own handwriting. The number is already there. You are only listening for it. She had listened. The tools her father had given her were still in the chest at the end of it. The chisels and the gauges and the long, flexible saw he had used for cutting curves in wet wood, each one wrapped in its cloth and placed where he had placed it. She kept them the way he had kept them, clean and sharp and ready, because he had told her that a tool kept ready was a question kept open, and a question kept open was the beginning of whatever came next.